Most people go into marriages hoping for the best. Divorce lawyers, they see what happens when things fall apart. After years of watching couples unravel, both emotionally and financially, today's guest, Aaron Thomas, reached a pretty blunt conclusion. Don't get married. He shared this advice with his friends often, but that changed when he met someone that he wanted to have a future with. And instead of pretending like the risk didn't exist at all, he did something smarter. He started reverse engineering every pattern, mistake, money fight that he saw in his clients, and he built a plan on how to avoid them. And today, he is sharing that plan. In this episode, you'll learn the most common and surprising reasons marriages fail, how to run a marriage check-in that actually works, simple money agreements that reduce arguments and increase trust, and a whole lot more. So, if you're partnered and you want to build a healthier relationship on your path to financial independence, this conversation will give you the tools to start using immediately. I hope you enjoy my conversation with divorce lawyer, Harvard Law grad, and founder of prenups.com, Aaron Thomas. During your 15 years as a divorce lawyer, you've witnessed over 100 marriages ending. What are the common patterns or behaviors you see in marriages that are falling apart?
I wish it were 100. It's over 1,000 at this point in my career. I think that the commonality that I've seen in a lot of marriages that come to an end is they didn't go wrong, they started wrong. A lot of it has to do with a failure to set the right foundation. You know, when I was working with my clients, going through a divorce over the years, often the problems that they brought up weren't something that arose late in the marriage. It was something that was always there underlying their relationship. And I think a lot of it comes down to a failure to communicate, it's a failure to communicate your desires. It's a failure to talk about important things, to get on the same page about things for alignment. And obviously money is a big part of that. So glad we're having this conversation about it.
Can you give me a couple of specific examples of some arguments that you've seen as common in some of these? Like I said, I love the idea that a lot of this has stemmed from what wasn't discussed or talked about beforehand. I'd be curious to know what some of those common arguments are.
Well, one of the big ones comes from not talking about your finances at all. There being a complete lack of transparency in terms of what each spouse has in assets and debts, what their spending patterns are, how they view finances during the marriage, how it's going to run. Are we going to put everything into a joint account? Are we going to give separate accounts? And if you don't talk about those things, it doesn't mean the problems don't exist. And issues tend to arise stemming from any one of those angles.
I'm guessing that you're not surprised very often anymore, but early on in your career, what were you surprised about that actually led to divorce?
I don't think it was a huge surprise to me that finances played a role. But prior to me becoming a divorce lawyer, I was a public defender. So I went from representing the poorest of the poor, and then I got recruited into a divorce law firm where we were representing the richest of the rich. And I think a lot of people thought, well, if you got all that money, you don't have financial problems, right? Like if you're rich, if you're a multimillionaire, what could you possibly be arguing about? And I was surprised to see that people who had a lot of money sometimes had not only the same problems as people who were not well resourced, but sometimes they had even bigger problems. They had bigger fights when it came to money. They were still stressed when it came to their finances. I started doing divorce work in 2007, 2008, 2009. Everybody kind of knows what happens there. And, the people who are wealthy were just as over leveraged, and there was a divorce boom. When there's a recession, divorce work goes up because whether you're, at the bottom of the financial ladder, whether you're at the top, the stress in the economic market reveals a lot of the financial cracks in people's relationships.
I heard you talk about that, and I was kind of curious and almost wondering what this community, the general feel around this community that is a lot of people are pursuing financial independence or are financially independent, if they would still have money issues. Personally for me, my girlfriend and I have way less fights about money now that we have a little bit more money, but that doesn't mean that the money issues are gone, or even my money scarcity issues are disappeared either. There are moments where I'm just right now, I looked back on, I reviewed all my November expenses and we're coming up on the holiday season. And I'm whoa, I spent way too much on Christmas gifts last month. And I'm getting a little nervous or a little scared about that. But then kind of looking at it in retrospective, my whole net worth and all of my income right now, I'm Justin, you can afford to spend an extra $1,000 right now at this time of the month. It's just, that feeling's not gone for me though either.
I think so much of it is about psychology. It's not just the number of dollars you have in the bank account. You've probably heard that thing where if you ask somebody what their ideal income is, no matter whether you're making 30,000 a year or whether you're making a million a year, everybody says double whatever it is I'm making now. And so, yeah, I mean, those problems don't go away even as you move forward in your financial independence journey. And I think obviously if one spouse is a big spender and the other spouse is a huge saver, it's pretty easy to see that that couple is going to have some issues. But even when both spouses are savers, it's unlikely they're going to be savers to the exact same degree. And even if they're both savers, they're going to want to spend money on different things, right? So one person might want to cut back in one area, but that might be an area that the other person wants to be a little more lax about. So the money issues hit us all, no matter where we are on the spectrum, I think, in spending, saving, income, all of the above.
In your 1,000+ divorce cases, did you ever see a couple call off a divorce?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are people who have tried to work things out. I mean, one thing that was really shocking to me is how many couples start the divorce process. And it was very common for me to ask, are you sure you want to go through with this? What kind of things have you done? Have you done counseling? You just want to get an idea of what their picture looks like. And so many couples had never tried counseling. They never tried to talk to anybody. They hadn't really made, they just go down this path and didn't really exhaust, in my eyes, all of the options to save the marriage. That actually led to one of the things that I tried to institute in my own relationship and that I now recommend for others, which is having like an agreement on terms of counseling. And so when me and my wife got married, one of the rules that we put in place, and we actually put it into our prenup, was that either one of us had the ability to trigger 3 counseling sessions every year of the marriage. So instead of having like the fight about it, what I saw with my clients is one spouse would say, yes, let's go to counseling. And the other would say, usually that suggestion came on the tail end of a big fight. The other spouse would say, take it as like an affront, take it as an accusation. Oh, you think there's something wrong with me? That's why you want to drag me to counseling. No, I'm not going to go. You can go to counseling. I don't want to do it. And then if they finally came around to the idea, the moment had passed, for spouse number one. And so I said, this is something I definitely want to avoid. And it seems like a relatively easy fix if we agree ahead of time. If we're having trouble, this is just the way that we're going to resolve conflict. We're going to go to counseling. Either one of us can pull that trigger, and it's not going to be punitive. It's just, this is the next step that we're going to take. And it gave us a framework to resolve conflict ahead of time that I think can be super helpful for a lot of couples.
That's such a good idea. Like, never even thought about kind of pre-deciding on that. I think, do you even go as far as like deciding the counselor or like how much you can spend or anything like that? Or even maybe more interesting, have you guys pulled that trigger at any point in time in your guys' marriage yet?
So yes, we have, and more than once. And I think what I've learned from it is that I think most people go to counseling too late. You can't wait until the relationship is at a 2 out of 10. The couples counselor themselves are going to tell you that you're too late, that you've allowed, the resentment and contempt to get too deep down into the relationship. And so the way that I look at it, and a lot of my clients, I think, have taken it a step further than I even imagined it, which is they say, we're going to do 2 counseling sessions every year of the marriage, no matter what. We're going to treat it like the annual physical, but for our relationship. And I think that, you don't have to wait till you're at like a 2 out of 10. If you're at a 7 out of 10, your relationship, and you want to get back to that feeling of a 9 out of 10, then you go get a little checkup when you are best equipped to improve the relationship. In our own relationship, I think that's become part of our strategy is like, whenever things start to get a little dull or, we're wrapped up in, parenting and the duties of careers and, everyday life, like maybe that's a time to just go get, a little check-in and reconnect and get some tools that we can use to improve the relationship before things get out of hand.
I think that's even a better idea. Like, why not? Like, now that you paired it to the annual physical, like I don't go to my doctor just when I'm sick or when something's broken. Like, I do like an annual physical, just a pulse check. And if there's anything else I can be doing or working on or, making sure that I stay healthy is great. And let's be honest, like if we're growth minded, there's always space for opportunity to grow as a couple. And it's not always just like an internal argument or disagreement that's putting pressure on the relationship. You mentioned like parents, like aging parents, I'm sure put a lot of stress and pressure on relationships. And sometimes it's good just to have that conversation out front with somebody like a counselor.
I mean, if you ask people, is your relationship perfect? Is it literally a 10 out of 10 all the times? No one's going to say, a liar is going to say yes, but everyone else who's being honest is going to say no. So just like you said, there's always room for improvement. I like attacking it from that kind of point of view.
Understandably, your work gave you this healthy skepticism about marriage, especially early on. And I love that you tell your friends, like, don't get married. But whenever you did meet someone, like I said, you started reverse engineering all of the issues that you saw with some of your clients. And I thought it'd be really fun to package some of the ideas that you've done with your wife and you've worked through with some of your clients as you've been designing prenups and kind of talk through a couple of really healthy marriage tactics. I mean, we already talked about one with counseling and the ability to trigger counseling sessions and or just pre-bake them in on an annual basis. But another one that I really love hearing you talk about is the annual shareholder meeting. Can you tell me what that is and why it is helpful for every couple?
Yeah, absolutely. First, to kind of give the context, I look at a marriage. A marriage is a financial partnership. It is not, some people hear that and they immediately recoil. I'm not saying that it is only a financial partnership. It's an emotional partnership. It is a romantic partnership. It's a life partnership. For a lot of it's a spiritual partnership, but it is, in addition to all those things, it's a financial partnership. And there are tools that we can take from other financial partnerships and apply them to a marriage. And that's why, I love the idea of an annual shareholders meeting where you sit down, you have a specific time, and you sit down and you have an agenda that you go through and you talk about things that don't normally get brought up on a day-to-day basis. An annual cadence is a good rhythm to sit down and talk about, what did we spend last year? What do we want to, budget for this upcoming year? Is this the year that we need to buy somebody a new car? Or do we want to take a trip overseas? Or, are we trying to have a baby this year? Any of those kinds of things. And then other things like just revisiting insurance. We changed car insurance this last year and cut our price in less than half. And it is something that came up from, this annual shareholders meeting where you take a look at your insurance and you price out a couple other options. And a lot of people don't do that for years and years and years, and they're way overpaying because there's just no other natural time to do it. And so we like the idea of coming up with, here are the things we're going to talk about. We're going to do it on an annual basis. The obvious things, spending, budgeting, but also planning for travel or for a baby, or do we want to move to a new house? Do we need to replace somebody's car? Looking at insurance, looking at subscriptions, is anybody watching the HBO? Do we need this, still coming out of the bank account? And just having a set time and can also act as a release valve for things that you mean to talk about, but you don't kind of have the opportunity to do.
That's interesting. Tactically, do you do it at the end of the year, beginning of the year? Is it some other time of the year? Is it always the same time every single year? Or how do you guys handle it?
Yeah, we originally kind of planned it for December. Sometimes it happens in January, but it's usually around the end of the year. January kind of works for some couples because December can be the holidays and get a little hectic. January, you have a full year to kind of like look back on and you can say, okay, what did we spend in 2025? And then it's still early enough that you can plan the year around. But for some couples, it can make sense to do it in the summer because you're on the school calendar year. And for a lot of couples, some of my clients have said, we're going to do it on a quarterly basis, or we're going to do it twice a year. I don't think that there's any magic to it as long as you have like a regular time. And I think at least once a year is definitely a good idea.
Anything special that you put around it too? Do you typically just do this at home, or do you guys take a trip and kind of build this into a trip, or anything in particular around that?
I think that there's a value in getting out of the house. I think that for me and my wife, at least, when we're at home, everything we look at looks like a chore and it's easy to get distracted. This past year, we went to a coffee shop, just our local coffee shop that we love, and we had our conversation there. And I think the change of scenery led to some other things. For us, it was really interesting. One of the things that my wife brought up was that she's always had this dream to take her mother to Paris. Her and I went to Paris for our baby moon back in 2019, and it was amazing, and it's beautiful, and it's romantic, but she'd always had this dream of taking, her mom to Paris, and she was kind of like, but I know it's probably not in the budget this year. We could probably never do it. And I was like, actually, we have like plenty of points on this credit card. Like the flights are covered. You could really just got to go home and plan it and put it on the calendar. And she ended up booking the trip to Paris that exact night. She called her mom, told her what the plan was. That was January. They ended up going for a week in February. They took our daughter along with it. That happened to fall on a winter break in February. It was just so amazing because this is something that like had been a lifelong dream. It's not the kind of thing that comes up in our like regular day-to-day conversations when we're just kind of making it through the day or through the week. But it's also something that could have gone a long time and just been a regret. And in her mind, she was telling herself, we can't afford it. It's not convenient. We're not going to do it. And for me, I was like, this is something we can absolutely make happen. And while she was gone, I went and did like a little solo retreat up in the cabins of North Georgia, which is something that I'd had in my mind that I wanted to do. But again, no convenient time to do it. And we both got, some people would say she won that exchange. I went to North Georgia, she went to Paris. But, we got to do something. And it came from having this annual shareholders meeting. And it really had nothing to do with like the budget, our savings, our insurance. But it created the space for us to do something that I think improved our relationship.
I love that. That's such a good story. And I love that it kind of went from tactical, logistical to dreaming in this like annual shareholder meeting. And I think it's like a great place to leave off on that. And it's like kind of cool that you encouraged her to take the trip. Like, we just looked at the budget. Like, we got plenty of money. Like, if this is important to you, let's do it. Like we got points that we need to spend. Like, that's a really cool and beautiful story that came out of that.
I think it extends to another idea for couples and for your listeners, which is some people fall into the trap of every conversation they're having about money is stressful. And so then they avoid having the conversations. And so I try to encourage my clients to come up with something that you both agree on, something that excites you both about money, come up with a shared fund. For me and my wife, we love travel. And so we have a travel fund that we both commit money to. For some people, it's like, renovating the kitchen of their house or, saving up for a baby or some other kind of financial expense. But if you have something that relates to money that gets you excited, then the conversations about money don't have to be stressful. They can be something positive in your relationship too. So then you're less likely to avoid the money conversations because sometimes it's going to be something that, that you both like, something that you both value.
Where are we going to go spend the travel fund this year?
Exactly.
Like, that's a fun conversation.
Yeah. Sign me up.
How do you guys put money into the travel fund? Is it like a pre-decided amount of money? Is it a percentage based on how much money you make? Like, how did you guys decide how much you're putting into that?
Yeah, our idea was the more money that we make over time, hopefully the more travel or the more, expensive travel or the nicer things we might be able to do. And so we set a percentage. We said 3% of every dollar that comes into the house is going to go into the travel fund. And that money is set aside ahead of time. And then whenever we want to take a trip, the money is there and it's already kind of pre-budgeted because we decided on that percentage ahead of time.
I like that. I do something similar. I have a fund. And at the end of the month, I reconcile my expenses, my income minus my expenses. And then I have some kind of dollar that's left typically. There are a couple of months that I do go over. But let's call it, I made $5,000, I spent $4,000, I got $1,000 left. And then I have to take a percentage of that essentially profit and put it into a fund. And I can't spend that fund on things like needs or saving and investing. I do plenty of that with the other percentage of money that's out there. And it's really fun and exciting because I get to like look at my wish list and be like, oh man, I built a couple $100 or a couple $1,000 in that. Like, what can I spend that on now? Like, and once again, it's almost like forced. For the savers that are out there, which most of this community is heavy savers, sometimes you have to kind of force yourself to spend money on things that are a little frivolous sometimes.
I love that. I've seen couples do that with like their year-end bonus, where they say like, we've got to spend at least 20% of it, because it's easy to be like, we weren't expecting this money. It's not part of like the monthly budget. We're going to stock all of it, every penny of it away. But yeah, if you set, or they'll say, or overtime or side gig income, or if I pick up, an extra shift on the weekend, and that money automatically is kind of designated for at least a portion of it for, what you would call the fund.
Let's transition to money agreements. There are a couple of money agreements that you and your wife have discussed ahead of time that help you guys reduce conflict. One of those is your purchase limit. Can you talk a little bit about the purchase limit and when you guys pull the trigger on that and how that's actually been helpful and not restrictive for you?
One of the biggest fights that I saw couples have in my divorce work was when one spouse would make a huge expenditure or incur some debt without a conversation with their spouse. Not difficult to see how that can start conflict. And so one thing that, and it's easy to see how those things can happen too, right? Because we get married later in life. By the time most of us get married, we're used to doing whatever we want with our own money. We don't have to check in with anybody else. We have complete autonomy. And then you have to shift when you're in a shared financial partnership. And so me and my wife wanted to avoid any of those conversations. We decided we're going to set kind of a large expense limit. For us, it was $500 to start with. Anytime either one of us wants to spend over $500, we discuss it with the other one first. For us, it's not about like kind of asking for permission or losing our autonomy. It's more like, this is something that impacts both of us. Let's have that mutual respect in our relationship where we have a conversation. And rarely in practice has it ever resulted in, no, you can't do that. It's more of just kind of like a check-in, and it gives the other person an opportunity to say, well, can we address whatever this problem is another way? Or is there a cheaper option? Or can we look at, this type of solution before we spend that money? And what it's done for us is it's increased communication, I think, across the board. We now probably check in with each other on a lot of expenses that are way less than $500 because we've exercised that muscle of communication about financial decisions. So now something, $200 we'll probably check in with each other on, just because it's now built into the fabric of our relationship.
Yeah, I love that you differentiated that it's not about limitation or control. It's about respect. It's about just keeping someone else in the loop. And especially as you have these conversations over and over again, you realize that the other person is not trying to limit you or trying to control how you spend the money. But also, it could be a good sounding board or brainstorming partner too, to be like, hey, I know you got to spend $1,200 on that flight to Paris, but I know we've been stockpiling some points too. Should we look at using the points potentially instead? It could just be a good partner to do some strategizing or brainstorming with in case there are some other options that you weren't even thinking about that might even save you some money too.
Right. And so that thing that you wanted, it could end up being a joint decision. Your partner can end up saying, yes, spend the money, yes, book the trip.
Yeah. My girlfriend's really good about credit cards too. Credit card hacking, credit card points. And she'll be like, yeah, totally spend that money, but book it through my portal so that we can get 2x or 3x points or something. I'm like, oh, I didn't even think about that. So I'm glad to run some of these decisions by her on occasion because she helps remind me on some ways to make a little bit more from each one of those.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about some other financial guardrails, conversations that you have? Are there any other things that you guys pre-discussed or pre-decided on that have helped you guys in your relationship?
A good rule is just kind of complete transparency pretty much at all times. It doesn't mean that, so in our relationship, we have kind of 3 buckets of money. We have mine, yours, and ours, right? So we have shared money, but we also have separate money. For some couples, they'll do what I call inside out, where all of their income goes into one joint account, and then they each get an allotment or allowance or whatever you want to call it that goes out into separate accounts that they can spend kind of however they want. For some couples, their income goes directly into their separately titled bank accounts. And then they transfer some money that's called what I call outside in. They transfer money into a joint bank account that pays for their joint expenses. So for us, we do inside out. And so we pre-decided kind of how much our monthly allowance would be for each of us. And that number has changed over time. Luckily, we've been married, it'll be 10 years in April.
Congrats.
Thank you. Luckily, we've made more money over time. And so that money that we each get for our allotment has gone up over time. Literally today, I know we're filming this in December. We did our kind of Christmas budget conversation over breakfast this morning, and we both transferred money into our separate accounts from the joint account to cover Christmas gifts. So she can kind of cover her side of the family. I can cover my side of the family. We built in a little bit of money so we can spoil our daughter. Those kinds of things work. But, what I've found is a lot of couples, we're talking about things don't go wrong. They start wrong. They get married and they don't really have a good picture of what their spouse's finances look like. There's no good time to have kind of the financial conversation where you don't slap down your personal financial statement, and at the very beginning of the relationship or on the first date. And so a lot of couples get married and they don't know their spouse has tens of thousands of dollars of debt. They don't know what their student loans look like. They've kept kind of separate, private financial lives. And certainly, you don't want to expose that information too soon. But if you're getting married and you don't know whether your spouse has $0 of debt or $500,000 of debt, then you've waited too late because now you're financially intertwined. And so, fun fact, for a prenup to be enforceable and a good idea for everyone who's in a relationship, whether you're married or not, you gotta disclose all of your assets and debts to each other. And I think it's not enough to just verbally have the conversation. I think at some point you got to put it down on paper and share with the other person so they have a time to take it in. They're not going to remember every dollar, that's in every, account that you have, or, your credit cards. And I find that naturally spurs other important conversations. All right, let's just agree. We're going to disclose our finances to each other. Let's agree that this is a no judgment zone, right? I'm not going to, whatever you have in credit card debt is fine. That then spurs a conversation. Okay, how do you get here? How do you look at these kinds of things? Are you the kind of person who you pay off your credit card every month, so you keep a zero balance and we're taking care of those points? Or are you somebody who you carry a balance and maybe you had to for some reason in your past, but then we can have a shared conversation about what's going to be our joint goal going forward. Are you all in crypto and, moonshot AI investments, or, are you an index fund kind of person, and let's meet in the middle and get on the same page about, how we're going to treat these things that are going to impact our life long term.
And how would you advise if people disagree on some of those approaches? I mean, you kind of mentioned the moonshot versus the index funds, or maybe better said, like risk tolerance, like someone that's very risk averse versus someone that doesn't mind taking on some risk, especially if there's a giant upside. Is there approach to that conversation or communication when couples just disagree?
That's a great question. And I think it doesn't have to be all or nothing. I don't think it's fair, and I don't think it's realistic to say that every couple has to agree on every single financial decision, particularly when it comes to investments. Different people are going to have different risk tolerances. And so what some couples have done is say, all right, 80% of our savings, our 401k and our brokerage account is going to be safe investments. We're going to do, index funds and maybe a couple tech stocks, do a little barbell method there. And other couple, and then that 20%, 10% is yours, 10% is mine. And I can dump it all into, Bitcoin if I want. And you can put your money into, whatever kind of, maybe it's a small business, maybe it's some other kind of fund that you have access to. And that way we both feel safe because we know the majority of our investments are in something that we both agreed to, but we still maintain a little bit of autonomy to do what we want and to take those shots, with an agreed upon portion of our savings or investments. And I think that gives, in some couples, they will agree on everything. I know a lot of couples we're index fund all the way, like
same,
all of it,
same.
like, lowest fee that I can get, I'm not going to pretend like I can beat the market, let's go all in on that. But if you don't, it doesn't have to be a fight. You just have to decide, how much are we going to allocate to our individual investment strategies.
And I love the net worth statement, or kind of putting all your assets and liabilities out there. I mean, that's probably just good practice, even if you're not partnered, but just an individual to kind of take stock of where you're at financially. But of course, it's a great exercise for any couples too, to make sure there's transparency on both sides. And then, like I said, joint strategy too. Like if my girlfriend came in with a lot of high interest debt, like, of course, I'd help prioritize paying off that debt for her. And we could talk about that and strategize that a little bit more. But if I don't know about it, then I can't do it. And if I'm over here kind of running my financial plan and she's over here kind of drowning in her financial plan, that's not going to help both of us get to where we're trying to get to.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I mean, there are very practical reasons why, these conversations can be helpful for both spouses. I mean, you have a situation where, maybe one spouse is not taking advantage of a match that's available to them in their 401k because they feel like they're struggling just to pay their bills. But together, they actually have the leeway. And it's like, okay, no, you take that match, you max out your 401k or whatever so that you can make the financially advantageous decision. And we'll take that money from somewhere over here from this other bucket. Or let's use some money to pay down the high interest debt. And maybe instead of, you paying kind of the max, maybe we'll reduce that student loan payment that's at 2%. And you have an opportunity to make a decision that is going to jointly benefit you as a couple.
To kind of put a bow on the financial guardrail conversation that we've been having too, maybe could you bullet out a few discussions that couples should potentially have? Like one that when researching you, I wrote down was pre-agreeing or deciding how or if as a couple you're going to lend money to family. And I could see that, if you don't have that conversation up front, but instead you're having that conversation when a family member really needs it, how that could put some added pressure on the conversation that, once again, probably should have been had years ago and pre-decided years ago. Are there some other topics that you might suggest or advise a couple talk through that are around the financial topics?
I think a big one is going to be how much of our money is going to be joint and how much is going to be separate. A lot of us for finances, especially in relationships, we do whatever our parents did,
Yeah.
and or our grandparents did, and we just pass it along and we never kind of question it. And so a lot of us come from these households that had like, there's one bank account and there's a checkbook. One parent controls the checkbook and every dollar goes into that account and every dollar goes out of that account. And, deciding which expenses are going to be joint and which expenses are going to be separate, I think can be a good and healthy one for couples. And what it's done for me and my wife is I am a brown bagger for lunch. I'm not eating out a lunch. And my wife, she likes variety. I can eat the same thing,
Same.
have that burrito bowl Monday through Friday, without trouble. My wife, she needs like some variety in her diet. But on the flip side, I like the gadgets. I get the new phone. I don't even know what the new features are. I'm getting that new phone every year like clockwork when it comes out. My wife, she didn't care about that. She'll take my hand-me-down phone from the year before. But because we decided that those kinds of expenses are eating out budget unless we're together, our like gadget budget, those come out of our separate bank accounts. We don't argue about them. We're not a perfect couple. I'm not saying we're like argument free, but we have taken some of these financial arguments completely off the table because we were able to say, okay, how much money? And that's part of the reason that we grew our allowances over time is we said, let's just take some of these more arguments off the table. If we double our monthly allowance, then you can do all of those things that you want to do that I wouldn't necessarily do with my money. And I can do the things that you wouldn't do because, it doesn't impact the other person. And we can do it with the comfort and knowledge that all of the joint bills are paid, the travel fund is funded, and then it makes it easier to have some of the other conversations where we can agree and we can invest the time discussing things where it's important for us to agree. Like, all right, family's coming in to stay for the holidays. How long are they going to stay? Let's set a rule. And I've even had clients put it in their prenup where they say, no more than 2 weeks a year are we going to have family guests in the house. Or, if we're going to lend money to a family member, number one, we're not going to lend it. We're going to give it away. And we're only going to give away what we can afford. And maybe we're only going to give away an amount that comes from your separate bank accounts. Me and my wife, we've had conversations. We want to do something charitable. We want to help somebody out. What we found is a good practice is if one family has a family member and they need some help, we'll set aside that amount of money to help them. But the other spouse gets the same amount of money set aside so that when something comes up, whether, a family member needs help or some charitable effort comes up, that they've got that same amount of money set aside that they can dedicate to that. And it removes some of the imbalance feeling like, oh, I guess we got to help out your family again. We got to bail out your sister again. That kind of feeling that can, breed resentment in relationships. It's something that it is possible to take it off the table.
You've been bailing out your sister a lot recently?
No, she's doing fantastic, but somebody's sister.
Let's shift the discussion to a topic that you're really passionate about, prenups. There's a lot of conversation around prenups. Honestly, if people search prenups in their podcast app right now, well, you're probably going to come up because you've had 30, 40, 50 of these conversations on some of the best personal finance podcasts that are out there. And I think, of course, the big question is always like, how do I talk about it? Why should I even consider a prenup if I'm not planning for a divorce? All of that's out there. But with that in mind, you really changed my opinion on it because you started making me look at it like a will or even insurance. Like, sure, we don't plan to crash our car or burn our house down or pass away, but those things happen. And with those things come financial cost. And I was kind of surprised on the financial cost of divorce. What's the average divorce cost in the US today?
The data says that the average divorce costs $30,000. In my experience, it can go way, way above that. That's an average. And that average takes into account the millions and millions of couples who have basically nothing to divide. Couples who are saving, who are building wealth. It is not unusual for spouses to spend 25% of their net worth fighting over who gets the majority of the other 75%. That is what scared me off from marriage. It wasn't an aversion to having a life partner or building a life with someone. It was literally the divorce litigation that I saw in my own work. It is painful, it's expensive, and it is for the most part, unnecessary. I don't think it's a controversial statement to say a messy divorce is best avoided at pretty much all costs. And there's two ways really to do it. One is to get a prenup, and the other is to stay married. And I think that you can do both at the same time. You can plan for divorce without planning to divorce. And it is just like you said, it is like insurance where you have it in place, but you can still do absolutely everything in your power to never need it, to stay married, to build healthy financial practices and other practices into your relationship so that it survives. But if we agree that marriage is a financial partnership, then every other financial partnership that you have in your life, you agree who owns what at the beginning. If you start a business with somebody, first thing you talk about, are we 50-50 on this? Or like, am I the employer? Am I putting up the money? And it's 60-40, it's 70-30. If we're buying a house together, same thing. You're going to decide kind of, what's fair based on what you're both contributing to it at the beginning. And marriage is the only financial partnership where you have to decide who owns what when you hate each other.
That's not going to work.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And there is a reason why the average divorce takes 12 to 24 months, and it drains people's bank accounts and the emotional and psychological and family costs when, let's just say what's fair at the beginning. Let's just say what's fair at the beginning. And if we're on the same page, great. You can put it down on paper and you can take that potential argument off the table forever. And getting on the same page financially is going to help you when you stay married. It's going to help you during the relationship itself, right? And if you're at the beginning of your relationship and you both say what's fair and it's something different, that's also good. You've exposed the disconnect at the beginning of your relationship, and now you can address it now rather than letting that disconnect fester in the background and eat away at the health of your relationship. One of the things I like to say is that the financial dynamics of your marriage reveal the personal dynamics of your marriage. You cannot have a healthy relationship if your financial relationship is messed up. Getting a prenup, or at least going through the process, it doesn't matter if you're never going to get married. It doesn't matter if you've been married for 20 years. You should still go through the process of everything that I recommend for couples who are getting a prenup. Disclose all your finances, set some regular rhythm to have these conversations, get on the same page about what's mine, what's yours, what's ours. Talk about what would be fair if you break up, even if you're just renting an apartment together, you got some, let's talk about what would be fair if things didn't work out. And then now you have a plan. The same way that you can build a framework for resolving conflict, like if something happens, we're going to go talk to a couples counselor. You can build a plan in place that says, all right, if God forbid we don't make it as a couple, can we do something that doesn't take 2 years of our life and 25% of our net worth in soul-sucking litigation off the table by having some important conversations in the present that will help our relationship in the interim? And so that is why I'm so passionate about prenups. The truth is everyone's got one. It's your state law or it's the one that you decide. Nothing gives, the government, the state, the ability to come in and redistribute or dictate what happens to your finances more than you can either commit a crime or you can get married. And either of those two things give a judge the ability to take your money and do something with it that you didn't plan, but you can take that off the table. You can decide for yourself what your financial relationship's going to look like and help the health of your relationship at the same time.
Very well said. I love the monologue there. I think that was a lot of passion behind it, and I understand why you do what you do. And that the idea that you have a prenup, even if you don't have a prenup, the state is essentially in charge of dividing your assets. Part of me is like, well, okay, let's just let them decide. You would think that they would decide in a fair and a reasonable way. But I know there are many examples that you have that you would think the state had a fair and reasonable way of dividing it, but that's not necessarily true. Can you provide one example of a situation that showed up in your time as a divorce lawyer?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that one, it's important to give a little bit of the reality, which is that as divorce lawyers, we plan up for a year and a half for one day in court. And then we go in there and the judge may have 4 hours for our entire case, 6 hours for our entire case. And we've got to give the full picture of a 20 or 30 year marriage. And in most states, in 41 out of the 50 states, They're what's called equitable division states, equitable distribution, which means that the court is tasked with dividing your assets fairly, but not necessarily equally. It doesn't have to be 50-50. It can be 60-40. It can be 70-30 based on a judge's subjective take on each spouse's contributions to the relationship. That's financial contributions and non-financial contributions. And the truth is, we all think we did most of the work.
Yeah, for sure.
That's just how it happens. I know this, and I still, I see my own efforts in the relationship, and my spouse sees her own efforts in the relationship. And so without even meaning to, people go into these divorce cases, and you are incentivized to mudsling. You're incentivized to aggrandize your contributions and to minimize the contributions of your spouse because your share of your life savings literally depends on it. The system is not set up to help you just fairly and quickly divide your assets. It's set up like a zero-sum game where the more that you minimize your spouse's contributions to your relationship, the better off you might be in the financial outcome at the end. And so that's why I say it's very dangerous to leave it up to a court. I'll give you an example. I represented a woman who had been married for 35 years. And her husband worked in the finance industry. So she trusted him with all the financial decisions. They did very well. They had a big house on a big piece of land. They raised a bunch of kids. And the relationship kind of went its course. And she came to me to hire me for the divorce case. And when we did the discovery, we dug into the finances. We realized that during the last few years of their relationship, the husband had gotten obsessed with these certain penny stocks. And he had gambled away millions of dollars of their savings on penny stocks. And they were left with $10,000 in their bank account at the end of the day. And
Yikes.
They were retired. They had no prospects of bringing in any additional income. And the court can't bring back the money that's already spent. All they can do is divide what's already there. And the court in this case said, ma'am, I understand that you trusted your husband, but it's also your fault. You went along with it. You didn't ask the questions. You didn't demand on transparency. And when you guys are a couple, the assumption is the financial decisions that you made were made jointly. They were made jointly with your acquiescence or by you silently not involving yourself in your financial lives by your abandonment of managing the finances of your household. Now, in that case, the judge did give her the majority of what was left, the strong majority of what was left, but it paled in comparison to what would have been fair. I mean, a fair, quote unquote, fair division of assets wasn't even possible because they didn't have the transparency built into the relationship. They did not have a joint understanding on what they were going to do with money. They did not discuss investments. They did not discuss incurring debt. Not only are there many situations where the court does something that you may think is like completely unfair. Maybe you remind the judge of their ex-boyfriend or girlfriend and, they have, or maybe they just didn't, they didn't eat lunch that day and they're tired. Maybe the judge is, they're just humans like anybody else. They can make mistakes. Maybe somebody got a better lawyer. Maybe you're just tired of the litigation. And so, the other person's willing to fight. And so you give them a better deal just to get out of the courtroom and get it over with. But the last thing you want to do is leave yourself in that kind of situation when, for relatively cheap and at the beginning of the relationship, when you love each other, you trust each other, communication is high, you're most likely to be fair. You can just decide what's fair yourself and take any of those nightmare possibilities off the table.
Well said. And I would encourage people to check out your work if they're looking to design their own prenup, stay out of the courtroom for years and years, really pre-decide what's fair and equitable. And also just help them guide them through some of the conversations that we talked about today around annual shareholder meetings and effective communication practices and pre-deciding what might be equal financial tactics and what might not be. So I really loved this conversation. I had a blast researching you, Aaron. If people wanted to check out more about your work and who you are, where can they go?
The easiest place to go is prenups.com. My book is available there. It's called The Prenup Prescription, Meet the Premarital Contract Designed to Save Your Marriage. And you can link out to our social media. We've got some free resources all on the website, prenups.com.
Once again, everybody, this is Aaron Thomas, prenups.com. Aaron, man, this has been a blast. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.